When people think of superheroes today, they think of comic book movies, and people may not think of DC more than Marvel. We'll see why. Let's start with what would be a failure. To say that a movie was a flop is a relative term. How does one judge a failure when it's art? Do you judge it by how much money the film made? By the reviews of the audience? How many people are talking about the film? If you ask Warner Brothers, they'd say that every one of their DC movies that couldn't compete with Marvel was a flop. The problem with DC is that they keep trying to keep up with Marvel Cinematic Universe and abandon any plan they have if it doesn't work right away. They jumped into the fray with Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice after only making one movie before. There's a reason why the movie is almost 3 hours long and contains virtually nothing but world building. Despite the many problems with Batman v Superman, it would actually be understandable if they just stuck to their plan. When the film wasn't as successful as Captain America: Civil War was because Zack Snyder, the director's vision, was too niche and hardcore for mainstream audiences, DC fired Snyder from the feature films. They hired Joss Whedon to rework Zack Snyder's Justice League, to remove several plot lines and hints of sequels from the film in hopes of making a more lighthearted and enjoyable for mainstream audiences. Whedon was tasked with playing it safe and turning the film into as a generic Marvel movie as possible. The problem with this is that the film was a Frankenstein's monster of reshoots, tonal changes, and abandoned plot lines from previous films that ended up going nowhere. Snyder's original vision, which he later presented at a Comic-Con panel, envisioned several more solo and team-up films that would have eventually led to a full and final conclusion to his cinematic universe. The problem with that is that it was completely abandoned after only 2 films. Imagine if Marvel had completely abandoned the Infinity Stone story arc, never made Avengers: Infinity War, and made a complete change to the tone when Thor: The Dark World didn't make as much money as Man of Steel in 2013. That's what's happening with the DC. The first thing Will McClaven, a student, said when asked why he disdained DC's films was, "There's no connection between them all." Although Snyder has now, 4 years later, been allowed to release his 4-hour version of Justice League on HBO Max, it's too late to restore DC to what it once was. If mainstream audiences even knew the difference between DC and Marvel, would they even care enough to invest their time and attention in 2 completely different comic book movie universes, one of which is a hopeless mess? Not only has DC abandoned Justice League Part 2 and the allusions to a world in their solo films, but they seem to have abandoned their entire film universe. Joker, one of their most financially and critically successful films in years, wasn't even connected in any way to other films. Not to mention The Batman, which will also be set in its own universe with a new cast and the rumors of more one-off DC films in the future. Can DC be better than this? However, that is where DC thrives. All of their best films, The Dark Knight, Wonder Woman, Shazam, and Joker, were made when they simply focused on producing a strong film rather than worrying too much about future sequels or world building. Of course, they're not going to reach Marvel's level anytime soon. They've fallen flat on their faces every time they tried. DC fans don't understand why they don't just try to be unique. Why does DC have to keep trying to follow Marvel? DC should try to turn the tables. They need to blaze their own trail with their own unique movies, instead of always trying to do something they failed with in the past. Why don't they focus on their strengths? Unfortunately, it seems like DC is heading in that direction by greenlighting more solo films and ultimately forgetting the embarrassment that was their film universe. With rumors of the new Flash solo movie possibly resetting the timeline, it seems like a perfect excuse to forget this ever happened and start with a clean slate. The DC films have been a failure, and it's time to move on to independent projects. But of course, there are always new problems. They always have a new problem worse than the last. Between the accusations of Ezra Miller and DC, which got a new boss at James Gunn, everything was destroyed. The movie Black Adam came out and was decimated at the box office. It failed so miserably that Dwayne Johnson lied about the earnings on Twitter, and Henry Cavill announced that he will not return as Superman. Almost 2 months to the day after Henry Cavill announced on Instagram that he was back as Superman. "I want to make it official," he said in the October 24th clip. The actors had to admit that he will not be returning after all. Instead, the new heads of DC Studios, James Gunn and Peter Safran, are forging a new path for the Man of Steel in a film written by Gunn that will star a younger actor. "I will not be returning as Superman after all," Cavill said in a new post on Instagram, December 14th. "After the studio told me to announce my return back in October before they hired me, this news is not the easiest, but that's life. The changing of the guard is something that happens. I respect that. James and Peter have a universe to create." The departure of Cavill's Superman was the clearest indication yet that Gunn and Safran are planning a major overhaul of DC. A reboot that will cut significant, if not most, ties to the previous regimes that oversaw the DC films for Warner Brothers. Cavill also made a cameo in The Flash, one of the 4 DC films scheduled for release in 2023, but sources say that cameo, along with Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, will now be cancelled as the studio has also opted not to move forward with director Patty Jenkins' version of Wonder Woman 3. Cavill found himself in a confluence of different headwinds at the studio. Dwayne Johnson pushed for his return through a well-received cameo appearance in Black Adam, a potential pivot to Johnson's own franchise DC. But Black Adam grossed only $389 million worldwide, casting doubt on Johnson's much-hyped plans for a sequel and eventual Adam vs. Superman film even before Gunn's decision. New Warner Brothers co-heads Michael Del Luca and Paul Abdi, meanwhile, wanted to make a sequel to Man of Steel and hired Peaky Blinders creator Stephen Knight to write the treatment. The classic character Brainiac was to be the film's villain, as source said. He ended up being a pawn of Dwayne's failed attempt to control a piece of DC, notes an insider. From this point, we do not know if they can come back from this or not, but we will keep looking out for this potentially amazing company. Of course, if you know any more, feel free to let us know in the comments.